Welcome to everyone who's joining from across the cybersphere for this second session in a three-part series on the warrior ethos of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP, of World War II. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Thomas, and I'm an instructor pilot in the 94th Flying Training Squadron based at Davis Airfield on the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I'll be your host today as we continue our discussion with WASP historian, pilot, and my academic hero, Dr. Catherine Sharp Landeck. Dr. Landeck is an associate professor of history at Texas Women's University, the home of the WASP archives. She's a Guggenheim Fellow at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, a Normandy Scholar, and a graduate of the University of Tennessee, where she earned her PhD. Dr. Landeck has received numerous awards for her more than 2 decades of work on the WASP and has appeared as an expert on NPR's Morning Edition, PBS, and the History Channel. Her work has been published in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, and Time. In addition, Dr. Landeck published her first book in 2020 titled The Women with Silver Wings, The Inspiring True Story of the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II. My teammate, Captain Carrie Wise, also an instructor pilot at the 94th, will be our producer today. She will be monitoring the chat and ensuring all our tech is running smoothly. I would like to take this opportunity to say well done to Captain Wise, as she hosted last week's session, and it received a lot of really wonderful accolades from listeners. If you missed that session, don't despair. We've recorded it and we will keep listeners posted on where they can be found publicly. Today's event is sponsored by the United States Air Force Academy Center for Character and Leadership Development, or the CCLD, in association with the National Character and Leadership Symposium, NCLS 2021. This year's NCLS will be held on the 25th and 26th of February and will cover the theme of warrior ethos. Follow the USAFA or the CCLD on social media, or head to usafa.edu to check out the full speaker list and to register. Registration is open to USAFA cadets and permanent party, as well as community members, but be sure to register soon as the window for that closes tomorrow, Friday, the 12th of February. Some housekeeping for today. Please remember to keep your mics muted and your cameras off. This session is being recorded, and the recording will capture any user with sound on. Additionally, the chat will be used to deliver links and amplifying information, but we've turned off the option for attendees to post to the public forum. You do still have the option to message the host, so please post any questions that you'd like to ask Dr. Landeck there. Captain Wise will select a few of your questions at the end of the session and pose them to Dr. Landeck. Finally, I want to just remind everyone to be respectful of each other. There may be some aspects of today's discussion that might be uncomfortable. Please take this opportunity to embrace that. I truly hope you enjoyed today's session, and I think we're checklist complete, clear for takeoff. So Dr. Landeck, welcome to our second session.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
We are super glad to have you back for a second session. Last week, we asked you to explain the WASP mission, give an overview of the main program leaders, and offer your take on the importance of allyship and advocacy in building warrior ethos. For the purposes of this year's NCLS, organizers describe warrior ethos as the embodiment of the warrior spirit, tough-mindedness, tireless motivation, and an unceasing vigilance, a willingness to sacrifice one's life for the country if necessary, and a commitment to be the world's premier air, space, and cyberspace force. Today, we will keep this definition in mind, and we'll explore some specific missions the WASP undertook, as well as the social and political context in which those missions took place. Before we get to that, though, Dr. Landeck, would you mind giving us a short refresher on the WASP program and mission?
Sure, of course. And, it's always good to have a chance to talk about these women and to put them into context of their times. Just a quick overview and reminder of who they were. So, these women served in World War II for the Army Air Forces, technically as civilians. They were brought in September of 1942. Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Love were women who were, well-respected pilots in their own right, and both advocated to the leaders of the Army Air Forces, whether it was Robert Olds or General Arnold, to get the opportunity for women to serve for the Army Air Forces. And then finally, in September of 1942, General Arnold agreed to let women serve as pilots. He was pretty desperate. We desperately needed more pilots. We had all these new airplanes that were being built, and we needed those airplanes moved from the factories to the points of embarkation. So they decided to allow for the experiment of letting women fly for the Army Air Forces. This was a very popular idea. Remember, we're coming off of the golden age of aviation when, people like Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh, and it was so popular. More people went to air races than went to football games in the 1930s. So this was a very popular avocation. So you have something like 25,000 women who apply to be a part of this program. Because they could choose the best of the best, only 1,830 were admitted to the training program. And between the 1,074 who graduated the training program and the 28 who were highly experienced women pilots who were able to go straight into the Army Air Forces, you have 1,102 women who wore those silver wings and served their country in this way.
Okay, thank you for that.
Quick and dirty.
Yeah, no, that's really good. It's very good because we have a lot of people joining us today that may not have been joined us last week, so which is totally fine, but that's great. I also just want to add a couple of points I've heard Dr. Landeck say before. The women flew over 77 different types of aircraft and flew more than 60 million miles. Those are just a couple of things I find particularly interesting.
Very impressive.
Yeah,
they were able to do during the war. Yeah.
Incredibly, just incredible aviators. Mm-hmm. It's hard to cover all that the WASP did. Honestly, every time we chat, I feel like I find something new. But the good news for listeners is that Dr. Landeck has released her first book, like I said, but she's also been featured in several different podcasts. So you can just Google Dr. Landeck and WASP, and I promise you'll find something that you can check out after these sessions end. One thing I really like about your book in particular is that when you talk about the WASP, you talk about them with personal experience because you are or were personal friends with a lot of the WASP. So I'm wondering if I can ask you some questions about a WASP that I had a chance to meet.
Sure, of course.
Okay, cool, good. Which is what we planned, so I'm glad you said yes. Good. So sometime in the early 2000s, I was assigned as an escort for Helen Wyatt Snap. She was in class 43W4. I met her at a fly-in at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, which for listeners, that's the home of one of the WASP training bases, and it's now the home of the National WASP World War II Museum. I understand that Helen flew somewhere around 11 different types of aircraft from her time in training until the WASP were disbanded. So just barely over a year. Was this experience of being expected to fly multiple types of aircraft typical among the WASP?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Helen was in one of the first classes. She was in 43W4, which was the fourth class out of 18. So she had an opportunity to serve among the longest. It was a 2-year-long program. The fourth class had about 6 months worth of training where they flew 3 or 4 different aircraft, Stearmans and AT-6s and BT-13s. And, so she had multiple aircraft during training. And then, she's in the group that got to fly different airplanes because they kept experimenting to see, well, can the women do this job? Can the women do that job? So, while the ferry pilots got to fly even more, from, okay, you've landed at the factory and delivered this plane, and, oh yeah, we've got a P-51 here that needs to go, and maybe you've never flown a P-51, but here's the specs on them, and read it through and take it off a couple times, and there you go, fly from California to Florida to deliver it. So they were expected to be able to just hop in a plane and, read the numbers and go. So that was a big part of the job.
And something you've talked about before is that one of the reasons that they kept going when they would be just basically, given the keys to the plane is that they had this focus of a mission. They were constantly trying to support the war effort and wanted to just do their part. Do you know of some specific stories of women really not having any experience in the plane and just being told to fly it somewhere else?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's, Teresa James was another one, and we can come back to Helen and talk more specifically about what she did as well. But one of the ferry pilots, Teresa James, I highlight her in the book. She was very funny. You would have all liked her very much. She was very funny. Teresa had that exact experience where she flew out to California and dropped off a plane, and they said, "We've got a P-51," and she said, "I've never flown a P-51." And they said, "Okay, you need to take it." And she was used to flying P-40s. She was based out in Wilmington, big, heavy plane that just kind of sat on the ground. And P-51s were much lighter on the touch, much more sensitive. And she talks about, they said, "Here, go take off and land 3 times, and then you can go." She tried coming in for a landing, and she said she hopped like a rabbit all over that runway, took off again, and then the fog was coming in. So she got down as fast as she could. And then the next morning when the fog cleared, they said, "Okay, you better go." She's like, "I had 2 really bad landings." They're like, "Well, you'll figure it out the next time." So she's on a solo cross country from California to Florida, no GPS, none of that type of thing. And just has to kind of figure it out along the way with this, really expensive, really high powered airplane that they needed in the war effort. And she didn't want to die, and she didn't want to screw up the plane either. So that happened a lot to these ferry pilots, especially.
Yeah, I'd say that not wanting to die is a pretty good motivator. For sure. I also know that Helen towed targets. You talked a little bit about that last week. Can you just talk about how it came to be that WASP did tow targets, and just a little bit about their experience doing that?
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought up Helen and that group. Helen was one of those first that ended up going to Camp Davis, North Carolina, because when the women were first brought in to the Army Air Forces, they were initially brought in as ferry pilots. And they did such a good job with it that the forces were, maybe we can see what else the women can do. Let's expand that experiment and see what else they can do. So Helen was in that first group that was sent to Camp Davis, North Carolina, to tow targets behind their planes, to train the men on the ground to fire their weapons at this moving target. Firing at a plane is different than firing at a duck, for instance. And the guns and weapons they were using was very different. So, they went out there and had a little bit of time to train, and then served in this really important role of towing targets behind the planes.
I remember when I first learned that they did this, towing the targets for people, and then to shoot live ammunition at them. And I just thought, what? Yeah. I've never had anybody do that intentionally.
Yeah. My airplane. It was all live ammunition, and often color coded, so they could see which gunner was hitting the target, not hitting the target. And, they tell stories of, them getting a little too close to the plane. Sometimes when the puffs hit in front of the plane, that it's time to come down and take a break and let them recalibrate the guns. But yeah, it was all live ammunition.
Do you know if Helen also was able to test some UAV technology or drone technology? I read somewhere that she did.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a group of women, and again, they kept expanding. And some of the WASP don't like when I use this term. Behadu, who we actually just lost last week. Behadu and I would sit on a panel together and talk, and I'd call them an experiment, and she'd say, "I don't like that." It's like, well, but that's what the Air Force has called you. And she's like, "I still don't like it." They wanted to see what women could do. What else could they do? And they just kept expanding it and expanding it. And they had this group of them, Helen and some of the others that had been at Camp Davis, went, and this was all top secret. And they had these radio controlled planes. And they were big. We think of drones today, and it's a little different, but the technology grew from this in the 1940s, where they'd have a mothership, and then the remote plane, and they would have one of the WASPs in the remote plane, and they would have WASP in the mother ship. And in the passenger seat, in the co-pilot seat would be the equipment that would be actually flying the plane. And the job of the WASP that was in that remote plane was to make sure it didn't crash, and to give the pilot and the mothership time to fly properly and land it. And then, you'd slowly, once the pilots in the mothership got the experience, you would take the pilots out of the drone plane. But this was all top secret. They did it down in Louisiana. Then they did it out in the El Paso area out of Biggs Field as well. And it really was important technology. And again, it grew into what we have today, but it was top secret. That's one of the things that most of the WASP didn't know other WASP did until, many years after the war. It was really important work.
Yeah, it's incredible to learn more and more about the missions. I mean, first of all, I don't think about, unmanned aerial vehicles or drone technology with regard to World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing is, just for some perspective, I've been in the Air Force about 17 years, and I've only been asked to fly 5 different types of aircraft, including trainers. So to think about someone having just roughly over a year and just having flown, 11 different types of aircraft,
Mm-hmm.
and then acting as a test pilot, basically,
Mm-hmm.
in that capacity is amazing. Which, considering that story about Helen and her role in developing that technology, can you talk about some other famous instances where WASP were essentially acting as test pilots?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, they did all sorts of different jobs, and we talked about that a little bit last time. I think one of the ways they were used that I think is really interesting, and maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but the B-29 story.
It's perfect.
Is this all right? All right. Yeah. So there were planes during the war that were considered unsafe. The B-26 was one of them that had a pretty unhappy reputation. But the B-29 was really the biggest, where you have some of these other planes, the B-17 that had been developed in the 1930s, and it goes through all these new models during the war, and some of these other bombers that were getting upgrades and being improved throughout the war. The B-29 was developed, on paper during World War II, and built and test flown all during the war. And it had some problems. The cowlings were too tight around the engines. There was part of the manganese in the motor, in the engine, that would overheat. And they had a lot of engine fires. And there was a very famous crash with some of the very best Boeing test pilots that crashed. And they were all on fire, and there were 15 people on board, and they came in low through Seattle, and ended up, there was a meat packing plant right at the end of the runway, and they crashed into that and killed people in the meat packing plant and everybody on board. And that was it. The plane already had a horrible reputation because it had all these fires. And all of a sudden you have all these airmen who are refusing to fly it, right? They're on bases across the United States. They're supposed to learn how to fly it, and they refuse. And Colonel Paul Tibbets at the time had been charged with training men to fly the B-29 because it was so essential for the war in the Pacific. It flew at the highest altitude of any aircraft we had. It was pressurized, and it could go long distances and carry heavy loads. And we had to have it for the war in the Pacific, and men were refusing to fly it. Tibbets was at an airbase and saw a pilot come in and stick a landing in a really tough crosswind in an A-10. And getting out of the cockpit was a woman. And he had heard about women being used to kind of show men they could do it in the B-26 at another base. And he's like, okay, that's it. So he called over to the WASP barracks, and he got that pilot, who was Dora Dougherty Struther. And the girl who answered the phone was Dee Dee Mormon. And he said, okay, you two, come on. And neither one of them had 4-engine training. They were both small. I got to know both of them, and they were both about my height, about 5'5", so not big. Of course, Tibbetts was about 5'5", 5'6" as well. And he said, "Come on, we're going." And he took them and he trained them to fly the B-29, this massive plane, in just a few days, just wringing sweat, stressful, heavy airplane. And took them up and got them their CAA license in the B-29. An engine caught on fire on Dora's test flight, on her check ride with the FAA or the CAA at the time. But they both got their licenses. And then Tibbetts took these two women on a tour of all the bases in the United States where the B-29 was. And they'd fly in, and the commanding officers on the bases would pull all the pilots and mechanics and crews, all of them in, and have them stand and watch. And they'd do a test flight, a demonstration flight, and show it. And then they'd land, and everybody's like, "Oh, that was pretty good. That's pretty good." And then everybody'd get out of the plane, and everybody'd be standing there looking, "Where are the pilots? Where are the pilots?" And Tibbetts would say, "Well, those two little girls who just walked out of the plane are your pilots." No, no, no. And then the male pilots would go on the flight with them, and they would stand behind. And if you've been in the cockpit of a B-29, it's huge. You could fit 20 people in the cockpit. It's so big. And so they would stand behind Dora and Dee Dee, who would then fly it and demonstrate. You had to be really precise with your airspeeds. You just had to, it was sensitive. And though they fixed the cowlings, the fact that they caught on fire on their test, on their check ride suggests there were still problems with this plane, but you could do it. And they proved that this plane was safe. And, Tibbetts' attitude was, we proved to these, these kind of male chauvinists. He said to me, he said, "There's nothing worse than a bunch of male pilots who think they're so good." And so I brought in a couple of girls to show them it was so easy to fly, even a girl could do it. I used their sexism right against them, and he laughs and thought it was so funny. But it worked. After 2 weeks, the men were getting back in the airplane. And obviously the B-29 was a great, heroic piece of the war. So it was using the times to the benefit and proving that women could fly these aircraft, no matter what plane they were given, they flew, and did a good job with it. So it was fun. And, it's easy to laugh at that and say these male pilots were, scaredy cats or whatever, but they weren't. I mean, it was a dangerous aircraft, and Tibbetts admitted that. He said, this plane had real problems. But once we fixed them and once we figured out how to do it, we had to convince the men to get back in, and this was a tool we could use. And the men appreciated it. We had Dora, 40 years later, got a letter from one of those pilots who said, "Thank you. You showed me that I could fly this plane, and it kept me safe, and I flew it the rest of the war." So he talked about it. Tibbetts talked about it. He said, "We played a real trick on those guys." Ha ha ha. But the men themselves appreciated it. And we have that evidence from their letters and things that it was an important trick that worked well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the B-29, in fact, because all the flying units that are based at Davis Airfield, where the 94th is stationed on the USAFA, trace their heritage to World War II. And those units flew the B-29, the B-17, the B-24, the B-26, the C-47, and of course the Waco glider. How likely do you think it is that WASP delivered some of these aircraft that people in our units during World War II were flying into battle?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, the WASP that were ferry pilots ferried most of these aircraft. So it is very likely that the men flew the planes that the WASP flew first.
I love that. I'm such a sucker. Yeah, I'm such a sucker for unit heritage. I love that. So these women they're flying all over the country. They're testing aircraft. They're testing the mission sets, and they're contributing to the war effort. What are some of the barriers that these women faced based on gender as they were carrying out these missions?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to remember the times in which they were living and some of those realities. There were definitely strict gender roles. They got expanded during wartime, where women were able to do different things, but you know, even things as distinct as their clothes, what they wore and what they were allowed to wear. We have stories of ferry pilots that, the women ferry pilots weren't allowed in restaurants because they had pants on, where, the stories that I've heard, the male ferry pilots who were with them threw a fit and left the restaurant with them, and they were, very effective allies in that way. But, that bias of, even what the women were wearing and able to have as part of their uniform. But, in the beginning, the women had higher flight standards. They were expected to have more flight training. They were supposed to have pilot training, and be pilots when they even joined the training. And things like that. They had to have a higher education level than most of the men who came into the Army Air Forces. And, you've got to remember, this is a time when we're drafting men. We're drafting tens of thousands of men and desperately need men to be able to go off and fly and fight in the war. So you're going to take more than the women. And again, we had 25,000 women apply. So you could have these higher standards. I think they have, age requirements that are different than the men, though it does adjust as the war is going on. I think the idea of the uniforms that they wore not fitting, the zoot suits they called them, but they're flight suits that were men's and that were all large. And so you see pictures of the women with these big rolls of the flight suits being rolled up and their big belts all around to try to hold their clothes on. And it's just because they didn't have them for women. And then you take a 120-pound, 5'3" woman, and they didn't have clothes for them to fly, and they weren't going to prioritize that during the wartime. I think they had different issues. This is a long issue that had been fought in the 1930s by groups like the 99s, but the issue of whether women could fly when they were menstruating or when they were pregnant. One of my favorite stories was there was an attempt for a while to prohibit the women from flying while they were menstruating. And the women's response was, how are you going to prove that? What are you going to, how are you going to do that? And the women were supposed to self-report, and they weren't supposed to fly for 5 days before and 5 days after. It's like, well, when is it they're going to fly? And the women said, okay, well, we'll let you know when, and of course, they did not. They just didn't report. And, the officers that were in charge of figuring this out, you didn't ask questions like that, So there were games that were played. Teresa James used to, when she'd RON someplace, she'd send a telegram back to report, and she'd put a little X as one of her notations, just to mess with the minds of the guys on the base who were supposed to pay attention to that. What did the X mean? Did it mean she was? Did it mean she wasn't? And they were supposed to report when they were pregnant and not fly when they were pregnant. And I know several of them who flew until they were 6 months pregnant, until the stick got in the way, the belly got in the way of the stick, they were still flying. So, and the babies were fine. And I know at least 2 who, went home and had the baby and came back and kept flying because they thought the work they were doing was so important. So, people don't know what to make of women sometimes, and don't know what women can do. Women know what they can do.
Yeah.
But it's just that uncertainty and in the 1940s, even today, people still are like, what? Yeah. And in the 1940s, they certainly weren't sure. So it's, I don't know, it's just really interesting.
It is interesting. And I mean, I've never been kicked out of a restaurant that I can remember for having pants on, but some of those
improvement, right?
Yeah. So we're doing good. But some of those things still exist today. Like, I'm sure many people on this call know that not that long ago, the Air Force actually increased the amount of time into a pregnancy that women can fly, of course, if they want to and if their doctors approve. But this is great because it enables women to stay qualified instead of having to take postpartum time to go through a requal, which is, of course, a burden to the aviator, their family, and the unit, which in turn could mean that that's a delay for upgrade to instructor, which could mean a delay for command, which could result in a perfectly qualified person, leaving the Air Force. So yeah, it's just interesting to see some of these through lines of things that we're still working on. But I am glad to see the Air Force making positive changes in that regard.
And issues about uniforms and hair.
Yeah.
And, all of those things are still being discussed. And it's just, as somebody who has spent a lot of time reading about a lot of this in the 1940s and talking to the women who lived through it in the 40s, to hear the same conversations being had today about uniforms and hair and things like that. It just blows me away.
Big victory for hair standards. Shout out to my ladies wearing ponytails today.
That's right. That's right. I read about that.
So I understand that Jackie Cochran, who again was one of the main WASP leaders, had some really strict social rules for the women. Can you just talk a little bit about some of those rules and why she was so adamant that they follow those?
Yeah, Jackie was very much a woman of her time, but more than anything, she was aware of her time. She was very conscious about who was watching them. They were an experiment. They could be ended any time. And she wanted to make sure that the women had a good reputation, and they reflected upon her. They reflected upon the Army Air Forces, and so she just definitely wanted to make sure that everything from their physical appearance, that they looked feminine, that they did their hair, that they didn't socialize with men. When they're in training, men weren't allowed to land on the airfield without prior permission. It came to be known as Cochran's Convent. So it was all about, protecting the image of the women and the image of herself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a shame that some of those things had to be considered, but what I really respect about Jackie is that she reads the room, if you will, and then she acts strategically to take the program to the very edges of the room and then just inch it a little bit more and a little bit more, sometimes without people even realizing it, all to support the war effort. And I really respect that. And one way she did that was by expanding access to training. So can you just talk about why expanding access to training was important from a war effort standpoint?
Well, she really did want to prove that women could do this, that more and more women could do this. And she really was patriotic. Jackie Cochran was a flawed character, right? She had a lot of issues, but she really did support the war effort and really did want to do everything she could, and believed that more women could do the flying that needed to be done, the domestic flying that needed to be done. So she worked really hard to make sure they had the best airplanes and to make sure that more and more women could fly. She wanted thousands of women to be able to go through this program and really advocated it, because the more women were able to do this domestic flying, which she called aerial dishwashing, right? That those flying jobs that had to be done, that weren't glamorous, but that women could do, like the towing of the targets, like the flying of non-flying personnel, or being the weather plane in the morning to do those types of jobs, that women could do that work so the men could be released. And that was her big thing, was women were releasing men for more flying, not replacing them. And she really believed that and wanted women to be able to release as many men as possible for that war effort.
Yeah, and the great thing about opening that training, and that's also something that's existing today, is flying is expensive. It was expensive then, it's still expensive. So if you can offer training to people, you might get more people joining than you would have before. And the Air Force now also has programs where it will pay for for high school students to get their PPLs, encouraging them to
That's
get
right.
involved in the Air Force. So, which, again, this is all about making them building the best air, cyber, and space force. So she pushes the envelope on the missions. She pushes the envelope for socioeconomic closing of barriers. And now I also understand that Jackie and Nancy pushed the envelope on race. So can you talk about women of color who were in the WASP?
Yeah, I mean, the WASP were primarily a group of white women. I mean, that's just the reality. That was who had access. That was who was allowed to be a part of the program. They did have some women of color. There were 2 Chinese American women who were part of it. Hazel Ah-Young Lee, who was actually in Helen's class of 43-4, and then Maggie G, who is in 44-9, who was in the second to last class, and I got to know Maggie. But the United States was allied with China in World War II, and so it was seen as an opportunity to have these Chinese American women be a part of it. And there'd been in the late 1930s and early 1940s, there was a Chinese woman who came to the United States and was trying to get the United States to ally with China and in aviation. And she worked a lot with the 99s. And Jackie knew of her and knew of these Chinese American women pilots who were flying. So that was something she allowed to happen. We also have at least one, maybe 2, but at least one Native American woman. She grew up on a reservation, a Sioux reservation in South Dakota, and she was a part of the WASP. Hispanic women, it's a little harder to know, but there were no Black women pilots, and that's kind of one of the disappointing aspects of this program is we had Black women who were qualified. The civilian pilot training program had started in 1939, and it was primarily, to gain, raise the number of pilots in the United States. People could see the war was coming, but Congress couched it in terms of a Great Depression program to save the aviation industry, to kind of appease those who didn't want us to be getting ready for war. So to do that, they let one woman in for every class of 10. So you have a lot of women who are able to get their flight training through this program. 40% of the women who became WASP actually learned how to fly through this civilian pilot training program. Yeah, it's a really big number.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's a huge percentage, and that's where a lot of the women in the later classes who weren't as wealthy as those in the very earliest groups who had bought their flying time, the women in the later classes, more of them are able to go through the civilian pilot training program and get their flight training. Well, there were these CPTP programs at Black colleges. There was one at Tuskegee, there was one in Chicago, at the airfield up there that Wilma Brown ran. So, there are flight schools for Black Americans, because flight training was still segregated at the time primarily, who were learning to fly. So you have these qualified women pilots. Janet Bragg, who was a prominent commercial pilot at the time, and applied to the program, applied to the WASP. And were turned down simply because of their race. They were told it's too hard. The armed forces were segregated in 1942, all throughout World War II until 1948. And the thought was, and the justification was, look, we're having a hard enough time getting planes for women. That's just too much to push to get planes for a desegregated group of women. And so I've got the letters. I know the names of at least 6 of these women who applied, who were, the letter just said, "Thank you for your patriotism. We don't have room for Black women, and you should join the WAC or do something else with your skills. And thank you for your desire to serve." So that's one of those things that we wish had been different, I think, because, you did have these qualified women who could have done the job. And, qualified men pilots were able to be Tuskegee Airmen. But these Black women just had one strike too many against them, right? If they'd been Black men, they could have been a Tuskegee Airman. If they'd been white women, they could have been a WASP, but they were Black women. And so it was just one strike too many.
Yeah, yes, it is something we definitely have to recognize. We just, it's a reality of what happened. And if we don't recognize it, we can't understand who we are as a force and where we really need to be going. I'm glad that you mentioned the Tuskegee Airmen as well, because I just want to reiterate that Davis Airfield is named after General Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who was a Tuskegee Airman. He was a leader of the Tuskegee Airmen as well. And then he was also the first Black general officer in the United States Air Force. So, we don't have time for it today, but other people can catch on one of your podcasts. I know you do talk about the connection and the strong bond between the WASP and the Tuskegee Airmen in the years after the war. So I'll just end before we take some questions by just reiterating that Jackie's such an interesting leader as a person to study. And I appreciate all the things that she fought for, and all the things that the women in the WASP and all the women and the men allies and advocates have fought for after that, because I certainly wouldn't be here without them. But I also have to be, and all of us have to be mindful of our role now in picking up that mantle. Warrior ethos is something that we cultivate in ourselves and in others. And when members of the team are facing barriers to their best warrior selves, it's the duty of all of us to aid in removing those barriers. So that's a good for the good of the person, but also in pursuit of the best air, space, and cyberspace forces, which, as we said at the beginning, is the very definition of warrior ethos. So, Captain Wise, do we have any questions out there in the queue?
We do. We actually have one from a prior retired U.S. Air Force navigator, actually, from 135 Qs. So the question from Colonel retired Mary Beth Ulrich is, did the WASPs use navigators? And if so, were the navigators men?
That's a great question. It depends on the flight. Especially on the B-29, they had flight crew that served with them. Dee Dee and Dora served as pilot and co-pilot, and then they had male flight crew that served with them. Most of the women who flew, you have groups of women who flew the B-17 and towed targets behind the B-17. There were 13 women who qualified to do that. And it was, they did have male crew that helped them doing different jobs. You'd have a female co-pilot and pilot, and then engineers in those positions. They didn't, in any substantial number, do fairing flights in the bombers and the larger aircraft that would have navigator positions. But they did work closely with the flight crews. Even the women towing targets in the smaller aircraft, they'd have a guy who rolled out the target and rolled it back in. So there was teamwork there for sure. It's a great question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Landick. One of the other questions we have is back to the very last point that was made. You mentioned some of the similarities between the WASP and the Tuskegee Airmen. What was the relationship between those two organizations during the war?
Yeah, that's a good question. So during the war, there wasn't much interaction. Everybody was so spread out. And during the war, you do have some WASP that served with a group of Tuskegee Airmen at Biggs Field in El Paso. Those particular airmen were going through some training. And one of the stories that I've been told is, the Tuskegee Airmen were relegated to a certain corner of the mess hall, and the WASP, who felt like they were kind of, not quite equals either. They picked up their lunch trays and went and sat with the Tuskegee Airmen quite regularly, and became friends. And then in the years after the war, they often shared tents at air shows and things like that. So, I think both groups felt that they had a bond there that carried on into the post-war years. And of course, the Tuskegee Airmen had the opportunity to continue to serve as pilots, as people like Benjamin Davis and Charles McGee, who I'm good friends with. They were able to continue to serve through Korea and Vietnam and serve as pilots, and the women were not pilots or navigators even until the 1970s. That second generation, which was so important to breaking down those barriers that the WASP started to break for us.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. Our last question for the evening. You discussed how strict Jackie was with the women, how concerned she was with the impression that they would make. Do you think that impression was a good one? And how did that impression impact when women were brought back into the cockpits in the 70s?
I think, the general public impression, there's two levels of the impression of them at the time, right? The general public saw them in a variety of ways, depending where they were. You have them on the cover of Life magazine and things like that, and the glamour girls and all of that. And we'll talk, I know next session we're going to talk about their disbandment, but there was a lot of negative press then. But then once they were disbanded, you have people like Bob Hope saying these girls were great and wonderful. And then if you look at it from the military side, I've looked at, every base as the WASP were being disbanded had to write a report on how they were, what their housing situation was, all that debriefing about them, but then a final analysis of, okay, were they any good, and to a base, they were effective pilots. Many of the commanding officers preferred the women pilots because they were there to do that job, not to do something else. And they were really effective as pilots. I think once you get to the 1970s and that second generation is coming forward, honestly, a lot of people had forgotten about the WASP. You have some that hung on, that knew about them. You have Jackie Cochran going before Congress, testifying whether women should be allowed to be at the Air Force Academy or not. I'm sorry to say she said they should not, and said that you would all get married and have babies and we shouldn't spend the money on you. I'm sorry to be a mythbuster about poor Jackie, but I think the men who served with them, and again, we'll talk about this next week, but the men who served with the women remembered them. And we'll talk about Senator Barry Goldwater next week and the fact that he fought for them to gain veterans benefits because he flew with them and knew that they were good pilots. So they did make a positive impression, and they end up serving as, to some extent, mentors to that second generation of women. The WASP were very intimidated by those women. They, the women are flying such great airplanes and are so cool. And I don't know, am I allowed to say badass on this type of show? Well, they were very badass, right? That second generation were so badass, and the WASP were a little intimidated by them. But once they figured out that they both liked each other, they really bonded, and the women were able to serve as a real mentors and inspiration for each other. So it's that impression, the WASP downplayed what they did so much, and they said, well, we did what we could, and we served for the war, and I think so often they just didn't realize how important they were, not just during the war, but to us today, and inspiring us that, I love this theme of the warrior ethos and this idea of perseverance and getting through these tough times. And, these women fought to get into the airplanes, and then they fought to get into all the different airplanes and do all these different jobs and prove that women could do it. They fought to serve. And then they fought to be remembered, and for those 38 who died to be remembered, and just that continued fighting. And it's hard as somebody who knew them and knew so many of them for so long, and to have them gone. But I think we just can't forget them, and that's our job today, is to remember them and remember their resilience and as you say, their warrior ethos. And they were human. They had petty squabbles, and but people like Helen Snap, who you met, was so humble, and I'm sure you can attest to that. She was just so humble and so funny, and but it's so much important work during the war. I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny.
I'm sentimental about them.
Me too. I mean, it is incredible to just hear their stories. And then when you start to think about the things that they did and then the through lines for how it connects to today. Mm-hmm. I mean, for one, it's certainly a good news story about why historians and history is important, from that contextual reasoning. We could actually use a lesson identified from before, and maybe we won't have to attack this again and again. So I think we actually have one more question that came in.
Great.
We do. We have one more question, and it perfectly links to how significant the WASP were, because they are leaving an impression still. They are still inspiring young women all over. So we have our 12-year-old aspiring pilot with us, and she would like to know, what was the main plane that the WASP flew during the war?
This is a good question. I'm happy to have you back with us. So I think there are so many different planes that the WASP flew, and so many of them flew different planes. But when we built the Rose Parade float, the Tournament of Roses Parade, that's January 1st every year. And you can go back and look, and it's on, you can find a clip of the float that we did in 2014, January 1st, 2014. And we decided to put a plane on the front of it. And we had all these discussions about which plane should be on this float. Should it be the bombers? Should it be the P-51? Should it, which plane should it be? And we ended up deciding on the AT-6, the Texan, because we believe that every WASP flew the Texan, either in training or in the work that they did. I think it is in every single WASP's logbook. So while not every WASP flew every plane, as a group, they flew all 77 planes, but not as many flew the bombers, and not as many flew the pursuits, but I think all of them flew that AT-6, every one of them who made it through the training. And that is a really incredible airplane. And if you get a chance to see one, and if you hear it, right, and you should look this up online, and you hear it, and it's one of those that you can feel in your chest, right, if you're nearby, and it rumbles and you can feel it, and it's just a really beautiful, powerful plane. So I think that's the plane that I think symbolizes the WASP the most, is it's not a plane everybody in the world got to fly, but I believe every WASP got to fly. So it's maybe not as cool as the bombers or as the P-38, but it's a pretty incredible plane. So if you get a chance to see it and hear it and smell it and feel it, you'll understand the power that the WASP felt.
Yeah, the AT-6 makes me think of Helen, actually, because when I met her, and I just did the math yesterday, she must have been in her 70s or 80s when she came to that fly-in. And what they did is they brought a lot of the WASP in those AT6s. And so the first time I meet her, she's in her 70s or 80s, bounding out of an AT6 at Avenger Field, you know, and again, being so humble about, you know, oh, no big deal.
Yeah, I flew that.
11 planes. That's good stuff. Okay, so this concludes our session 2 in our 3-part series. Please be sure to tune in next week. We'll discuss, as Dr. Landak said, the disbandment of the WASP, and we'll talk about their warrior ethos as they faced a lot of barriers once the program ended. So thank you all for joining. Thank you to Dr. Landak from Texas Women's University for sharing the WASP story and educating us on their warrior ethos. I hope to see you all next week or at NCLS on February 25th or 26th, and the links to both of these events are in the chat. Thanks again, and I will end today's session with the WASP motto: we live in the wind and sand, and our eyes are on the stars.
Very nice. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks.